The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hello, I'm Alison Larkin, writer, comedian, narrator, and host of the Jane Austen podcast. Join me as we embark on a journey through Austen's timeless stories, starting with Pride and Prejudice. The Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is like, if you remember, if you grew up in the 90s, this is a very special episode of Vulgar History. So in 2021, I asked on Instagram for suggestions of people, lesser known women from history, to talk about on Vulgar History, which, just so you know, I'm always open to suggestions and recommendations. And a person from Ireland, whose name was Egg, whose name maybe still is Egg, sent me a message saying Fredegund in like all caps, as I recall. And I was like, well, who is that? And I looked up Fredegund's Wikipedia page, and I was so captivated by it. There's still a highlight. If you go to Vulgar History Pod on Instagram, I have a highlight of all my frenetic stories from when I first just read the Wikipedia page for Fredegund. I was like, this story is everything. And then I read an article about Fredegund, and at the bottom, the article is written by Shelley Puhak, and it said Shelley Puhak is working on a book about Fredegund. I was like, there's going to be a book about Fredegund, and it's a book about Fredegund and Brunhild, who was another queen at the time. The book is called The Dark Queens. I got an early advance copy of it. If you go to the Fredegund highlight in my Instagram stories, you'll see me frantically posting screen captures from that ebook because I was compulsively interested in it. I did 3 episodes about Fredegund, 3 hours worth, because I could not spare any detail. And then later I invited Shelley on the podcast to talk about her book. And she was like, why do you like Fredegund so much more than Brunhild? And I'm like, I don't know. It's partially because that was the name that was suggested to me. And so that was the person I was researching. So everyone around her was like, well, that's Fredegund's husband. That's Fredegund's son. That's Fredegund's enemy. That's Brunhild. But anyway, Shelley is much more even-keeled about these things. And then in the subsequent years from 2021 until now, people have told me how much Fredegund means to them. It's a lot of people's favorite episodes. I just heard recently somebody's car is called Fredegund. I know that people have avatars and video games called Fredegund. Like it's a whole thing. Fredegund is just everything I want in a story. She's maybe my favorite person I've ever read about in history, full stop. I just can't get enough of Fredegund. She's just a messy bitch who lives for drama and murder, and it's everything. But I've also since those episodes. Heard from lots of people have read Shelley's book, which is called The Dark Queens. You should read it. There's a paperback out now. There's an audiobook. It was a national bestseller, finalist for the Goodreads Choice Awards, partially because I strongly encouraged the Tits Up Brigade to vote for it last year. Anyway, it's a great book. People have said, I read the book, and they're almost apologetic. They're like, and I think I prefer Brunhild. And that's fine. That's fine. You can like Fredegund best. You can like Brunhild best. You can like both of them. It's not an option to like neither, because if that's you, then this is not the right podcast for you. So I have been meaning for ages to give Brunhild her due, to do an episode from Brunhild's point of view, which she did live several decades longer than Fredegund. So we're getting into talking about the story of Brunhild, gets into, decades later than Fredegund lived. Fredegund, she lived fast, she died young. Brunhild, her story is a really different vibe. And this is what comes across in Shelley's book. Like, both of the women were there, and often they're pitted against each other, especially in like 19th century operas and things like that. Like, it's exciting, I guess, to some people to be like, oh, these two women, and they were like rivals against each other, like how people like to pit Mary Queen of Scots against Elizabeth or whatever, where it's like, well, they were there. And they were enemies at times, and they were not enemies at other times. But they were really, it's like they represented countries, and the countries were at war. It wasn't like a personal vendetta between the two of them. Anyway, Fredegund is always going to be my girl. But Brunhild, when I reread The Dark Queens, just to refresh my memory, but also to just like look at it from Brunhild's point of view. And on reading it and in talking to Shelley, I've really come to appreciate Brunhild more. Like, Fredegund is always going to be my forever number one, but Brunhild is up there. Like, she's a legend compared to so many other people we've ever talked about on this podcast. And Shelley, she's kind of team Brunhild, so I'm not objective. I had to bring her on. So anyway, enjoy the next 2 hours of me and Shelley Puhak talking about the amazing, the iconic Brunhild of Austrasia. So I'm joined today in a repeat appearance by Shelley Puhak. Welcome, Shelley.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So I was looking to see, and I can't believe it was so long ago that the Fredegund, I'm thinking in French right now, Fredegund episodes came out. It was like 2021, but that was just before your book came out, right? Is that when it came out?
What? Yeah.
It seems so long ago.
It was like eons ago.
Yeah. No, and I don't know, it still seems so fresh to me. I was just rereading your book to get ready for this episode, and I was just as in. Actually, no, I did get as into it, but I started reading. I'm like, oh my God, these names. I need to adjust my brain to remember just the place names and the people names and everything. How has the last 2 years been for you? Like, with your book, what's your experience been like, with the book coming out in the world and people responding to it?
It has been better than expected. I've been really pleased with like the response. I've gotten to meet a lot of like really enthusiastic readers, but from all walks of life. So I love that about this story, where I get everyone from, really erudite like history professors to teenagers. I just did a reading and book signing a little while ago. I think it was 2 weekends ago, but it was at a Renaissance festival. I had to appear in like they requested period wear. So let me tell you, it's tough still to find like proper Merovingian dresses. But, it was really great. And I had everyone there from, like I said, kind of your typical Ren Fest, Ren Fair folks, to like, I had a lot of like grandparents who were into looking at the book for like their daughters or, maybe their sons. That would be great. So it's been marvelous, and it's been out in paperback, and it even cracked national bestseller. So
that's so exciting. And was it last year? It was one of the finalists for the Goodreads Reader's Choice as well.
It was, yeah.
I did what I could to get the Fredegund gang to all vote for you, but you got to the final round. Yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. And you guys are very committed. Fredegund has an, really committed fan base. It's pretty daunting.
Well, that's part of why you're here. Brunhild deserves as much love and admiration as Fredegund. A couple of weeks ago, it was like I forget. I was just asking on my Instagram stories because it was some anniversary for the podcast. And I asked people, what's something that you've enjoyed in the podcast or I didn't even ask what was your favorite episode or your favorite person, but I was like, what's something you've learned? And so many people were like, Fredegund.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. So it made me glad. That made me glad when I was rereading your book and remembering how she was so forgotten after she died, that there's this resurgence in people who love her, including me. But we're here to talk about Brunhild because your book is The Dark Queens. It's about two people. Brunhild deserves to be discussed. And actually, that's funny too, because I just heard every now and then people tell me like, oh, I read the book, and almost apologetically, they're like, and I think I prefer Brunhild. Like, that's okay.
I love the apologetic nature of it.
Yeah, Brunhild is great. So I was rereading your book for this conversation, focusing on her. Fredegund has got this sort of, she charges into the story with, poison daggers and everything, and that just captures one's attention. Brunhild, I was thinking about this. We're going to talk through her story, but like she's from a royal family. She didn't have to work and strive like Fredegund did to get into a position of power. And so I think part of where I sided with Fredegund a bit is just that underdog quality.
Absolutely. And she reminds me so much of the Hercules Mulligan quote from like Hamilton, like, you knock me down, I get the fuck back up again. Like, that's just Fredegund.
Yeah. But Brunhild, impressive. She had different challenges stacked up against her. It was never a question of, is she allowed to be in this echelon of monarchy? But once she was there, I mean, that's what we're going to talk about. You know what? If people haven't read your book yet or haven't listened to my 3 hours of Fredegund podcasts, can you remind everybody the place and time that this is? Because it's still such a under discussed part of history.
Absolutely. So we are in 6th century Francia, which is, it sounds like, obviously, it's going to lead into modern day France, which it does, but it also encompasses all of the Low Countries, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, large parts of Germany, Switzerland. So we're talking like a huge bulk of continental Europe at this point in time. And we have Brunhild, who is coming from what we now call Spain. It was run by the Visigoths. And she's marrying into this Merovingian royal family, the Franks, who are commanding this huge empire on the continent that adjoins, Visigoth Spain.
Can you explain? Because again, it was interesting to read your book after a couple of years and just be like, this all seems like so many of the crises occurred because of this unusual way of dividing up who's in charge of what. Instead of the eldest son inherits everything, can you explain how it was divided, which just seems like the worst plan?
It seems like, who came up with this? So the Franks don't practice primogeniture, which means that the oldest son, as you mentioned, doesn't just automatically inherit everything. So they just split it up between whatever male heirs there might be. And those could be legitimate or illegitimate. So as long as you are a son of a king, you have a stake in the kingdom. And, men are dying left and right between the dysentery and the wars, et cetera, et cetera. But kings are having quite a lot of kids in these days. And so most of them end up with like a whole clutch of sons that are then left after the death of their father to sort of duke it out. And the last one standing gets the whole kit and caboodle.
It happens. We're going to go through Brunhild's life, start to finish, but just so many times in that era, it's like, okay, the lands are all divided up, then one of those guys dies. And then there's this scramble, who's going to take it over? Is it going to be this? And then at one point, it's like all children overseeing everything. It's just a bad plan.
I think about how like we pride ourselves, most democratic governments now, on having this like peaceful transfer of power. And, when we don't have a peaceful transfer of power, that's kind of, we're, all just shocked, as we should be. But you think about this, there was never a peaceful transfer of power. Like if there was, that was remarkable. And they were like, this is so peaceful, we don't even know what to do. But most of the time, the minute the king died, even if you were like a regular poor farmer, like you had to batten down the hatches and hunker down and hide because it was the purge. Like everything was, all hell was breaking loose. And, that's one thing if it happens once in your lifetime, but if that is happening like 4 or 5 times in your lifetime and you're just a regular person trying to grow crops and like feed your family, that's incredibly like disruptive.
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking about, yeah, the ordinary people, because everything, like mostly what's in your book is kind of the actual scheming that's going on. Everybody, it struck me again, rereading it, just even a person who appears for one page or half of one page, like everyone is just poisoning each other, murdering each other. Like that's the only way to survive. So Fredegund and Brunhild both did a lot of poisoning and murdering, but it's kind of like, well, if they didn't, then they would have been poisoned or murdered. That's just what everyone was doing.
It's remarkable. And you know, the crazy thing is there are things that had to be cut out of the book. Like there's more poisoning and murdering, but there was just too much to all, squeeze in there.
It was just, I started going through it. I was reading it, an ebook copy just on my phone. And I started taking just screen captures of everything that was interesting. And then it started being like every other page because I'm just like, oh my God, this person did this. Then this person did. It's unrelenting. And then I think it speaks to the power of Brunhild that she and Fredegund capture the attention as much as they do, even surrounded by so many other major personalities. So she's born in basically modern day Spain. And then she's married. Oh my gosh. Okay. Again, I read your book as a book. I've not listened to the audiobook. My pronunciations, I have no idea. So she's marrying King. How do you say it?
I say it's Sigebert, but here's the thing. So for you and for all listeners, even in their lifetimes, there are varying pronunciations of the same name. So like if you're in the ballpark, it's okay.
Okay.
Like they know how to say all of their names. So if that makes you feel better, there's no like official pronunciation.
Okay. So she marries King Sigebert of Austrasia. The other day I saw something about Australia and I was so much in the world of your book, I read it as Austrasia. But I just have some notes in front of me. Honestly, it's just sort of like the Wikipedia entry to remind me, like point to point, what happens. But it says upon their marriage, she converted to Catholicism. And so Christianity is still fairly new.
It is. And there are these different sects. So there's an Arian sect, and there is what will become Catholicism. They don't call it that. But what's really fascinating is like the Arian version, and this actually like will crop up later for people who are really into like the Reformation or like the 15th, 16th century. I did not know this, but it does kind of pop up. But Arianism is much more chill with other religions in the fact that it's like Jesus is, a prophet, but Muhammad can also be a prophet, and so they are open to coexisting with other religions, and they have much more of a like a global tolerant view. They have this one envoy who's reported to have said something, and I'm paraphrasing it poorly, but to the effect of like, if you don't believe as we do, that's okay. Like we can coexist, and what will become the Catholics are like, if you don't believe as we do, like we're going to have to kill you. So it's two interesting worldviews, but I think it also kind of foreshadows a lot of the struggle and like the outlook that Brunhild has, that she's raised with this slightly more tolerant view of religion, not quite so rabid.
Can you explain, and I don't know if you know, so it's interesting. So it's called Aryan, but that's different from how we hear Aryan now as like,
yes, it sounds super scary.
Nazi.
So it's RIAN, no Y in there. And it was named after a bishop who championed it. That's all I know. So there was this bishop, and it became Arianism after Bishop Arian.
And it's very much the opposite of Nazism in that it's
Opposite of Nazism.
Tolerant and open-minded. Okay.
And there's this idea that perhaps, like, so as we know, Spain is going to be, conquered and, become Muslim in parts, right? Like pretty soon. But that's one of the reasons why it was able to happen, is because Arianism and sort of Islam, it wasn't like, oh, these are enemies, but they were like, okay, so you have a different prophet and you want to use this different name. Like, okay, that it might have made it a little more palatable to some of the people there.
And so she married King Sigebert, and this was taken. So his brothers had not married a royal person, which Brunhild was a royal person. So this was taken by the brothers as like, because the brothers, each of them has their own kingdom, and they're just kind of always looking for a reason to fight each other, is my impression. And so they're like, he married Brunhild, and then that made the other brothers be like, he's saying he's better than us because he married a royal.
Absolutely. And he has this whole alliance now with Visigoth Spain. And if you can visualize this, Sigebert's in what would be the northeast, like quadrant. And, we know where Spain is, which would be in the southwest. So he's basically has now an alliance where he's on either side of his brothers. So they were right to be nervous. And he certainly has like aspirations, but he's like, I've got friends now blocking you on this side. We've got water on some of the other sides, and I'm over here.
And then one of the brothers, is this probably one of the reasons why, gosh, sorry, these names, I'm just like, I had it in my head when I was reading the book. Is it Chilperic? Yeah, Chilperic is the one. So he was like, okay, well, I'm going to marry Brunhild's sister then. I'm going to also ally with these people.
Yes. And so he's like, I'm going to counterbalance this. Like, I want a royal, princess. You have a royal princess. So if I marry her sister, then that kind of knocks out any advantage you have.
And that sister is, my gosh, Goiswintha?
Yeah, it's really confusing because their mom's name is Goiswintha, and she's a whole character. If we have a minute, I'd love to talk about her. And then she has two daughters, only two daughters, no sons, Brunhild and Galswintha.
Galswintha. That's the other thing that gets me, is when someone has a child and the name of the child is so close to their own name, but not quite their own name.
Yes. And you know what? They did this thing where they have two-part names, and they would take like one part from the mom's name and one part from like the dad's name. So like Goy's Wintha is like, well, my daughter, I'll put a Wintha at the end of it, and then I'll get the other part from my husband. So they would like keep mashing these two parts of the names together, but then you end up with a lot of like really similar sounding, really long, complicated names. Like I really want to just, if they didn't all start with C's, I'd be like, can we just give them initials? But no.
Yeah, I was just so delighted in your book when someone pops up and his name is Maurice. I was like, I know how to pronounce that. Gregory. Great.
Yeah, and there's also those great names that are like Gogo and Bozo, which I'm like, that was like, thank you. Thank you for making things easy.
Yeah, much less letters than usual. Okay, so we've got Brunhild's husband, Sigebert, and then his brother, Chilperic, has married Brunhild's sister. And then that goes badly because of various reasons, but Fredegund. And that there's something in the marriage agreement for Chilperic that said you're going to marry Gelswintha, and one of the things is like, and you will not fuck around with your servants, and which is like not usually in marriage contracts.
No, it's not. So this was, it had raised enough eyebrows, and one can assume that Brunhild, having married into the family first, maybe gave her family back home a heads up. Like, there's this rumor, or we know that he has this special relationship with this servant girl, and that they made sure to put in there that he would, not have any mistresses, particularly any servant mistresses, that Galswintha would be his one true loyal, Christian wife. And the other thing that's interesting is Chilperic, because he was like a lesser brother than Sigebert, in order to score Brunhild's sister, had to promise, like, essentially, Sigebert marries Brunhild. It's kind of a match of equals. And he certainly gives her some cities, which that was like your morning gift. You got a Morgengabe, which was like, did the deed after the wedding, you get a city, or you get a nice mansion. But he gives to Galswintha a third of his kingdom. Like, that's the only way he can make this match. So he says, I'll give her, essentially a third of my kingdom. And it's land that adjoins what will become Spain. So the Spanish king, is like, okay, like, you're going to give me a third of your kingdom that will go to any of my grandchildren, that you might have with my daughter. Sounds good.
But then, okay, so what happens is that Galswintha is found mysteriously strangled, and like the next day, Chilperic marries Fredegund. And they were married for a very short time, right?
They were married for a very short time, and yes, it was exactly 3 days after her, murder, he marries. So essentially, people have made jokes like maybe they were able to use like the food from the funeral for the wedding feast. But, that is shockingly fast, shockingly fast.
And so, like, from Brunhild's point of view, or for honestly anyone's point of view, like, he made this deal to marry Galswintha, giving her all this land, and then seemingly, I mean, who we don't know what happened, but like clearly he had Galswintha murdered so he could marry Fredegund. Seems pretty obvious. Like, what the hell? Like, why would he throw that all away? That's crazy.
It's absolutely crazy. And imagine being Brunhild, if we can, empathize with her a little bit, where you do have this like great background, but you're in this land where you don't speak the native language. You can obviously communicate in like Latin, and you've been married for a very short period of time. And your sister's been married, and you're looking forward to this like kind of great alliance where your sister's going to be in the neighboring kingdom, everything's set. And then she's murdered. You don't know what people around you are saying. And, that had to be incredibly scary. And you don't know if you're next. Like,
Yeah.
at this point, you don't know who is, conclusively like, who killed your sister? Where are they? Are they coming from you? Like, and why? And at the same time, what makes things even more crazy for Brunhild, and also is probably why Chilperic was able to act, is that Brunhild and Galswintha's father has died.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Knows that the kingdom is in shambles right now, and they're not going to be able to launch a war for a little bit. So he's like, I've got a couple months because they don't know what's going on. So it's definitely like, this is not an act of passion. This seems like it was something that was plotted very carefully because the timing lines up. But if you're Brunhild too, normally dad would be the one that's going to send in the army to defend his daughters. And you don't know who's going to be in charge. Is it going to be your dad's faction and you can rely on these people to kind of come in and back you up? Or is somebody else going to come out on top? So essentially you're in a strange land where you don't really know the political landscape, and, somebody's gunning for you. I mean, it had to be very terrifying.
And she was very young. I mean, we don't know how young, but I'm guessing, I don't know, 18 or something.
Yeah, we assume that, I think by all of the available evidence and counting back, that she's 18. She could have been 19. She could have been 17. But, she's right around there.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, extremely young. She hasn't had children yet, I don't think, because she's only barely gotten married herself.
She was pregnant when this happened.
So she's pregnant, away from home. Her dad dies. Her sister is murdered. It's, yeah, right away, it's like, it's not hard to sympathize with this scary situation she finds herself in. And then, like, war is inevitable, I think, by him obviously murdering Galswintha. And so this is where their two kingdoms, Chilperic and Sigebert, go against each other, yes?
Yes. And, essentially Brunhild most likely would like some vengeance, but there's also this third of Chilperic's kingdom that's in the balance, because Brunhild's like, you murdered my sister, but those were her lands. I'm the heir now.
Oh, yeah.
Kingdom. And Sigbert's like, yeah, like you can't just negate that land deal. So it's clearly, we could say it's, for like these moral reasons, but at the heart of everything the Franks do, it's always land. Like, these people are obsessed with land. Part of it's like a third of the rival kingdom. They're not going to just let it sit there.
Yeah, and I think this is where, and you talk about this in your book, but some previous writings about this, or I think I would imagine some of the old operas and things, or say like, Fredegund was complicit probably in the murder of Brunhild's sister, and ever since then the two women just hated each other. Where it's like there's more to it. I'm sure that was distressing, obviously, but like they're both smart political actors in this. They're not just like crazy women having feelings.
Absolutely. And we could also think about how Sigebert and his court had been waiting to kind of launch an attack on one of his brothers. And this is like the perfect opening. This is, you can imagine what we would, any country would do with this today. Like, what? You killed the first lady's sister? Okay, we've wanted to invade you. We're going.
It's the perfect reason. So there's another brother we haven't mentioned, which is Guntram, who I always picture, I don't know how much older he is, but he just seems like old and kind of conservative and like kind of, the other two are just messy. And Guntram just seems kind of more, almost like a father figure, sort of.
He is so like kind of pedantic. And later on, he kind of cracks me up because he has these things where anytime anything goes wrong or a war doesn't go his way, it's never his fault. It's not like he's not a great general, but he'll say things like, if the youth had more religion in their lives, these things wouldn't happen. So he's very like, almost like even when he's 30, he has the mentality of kind of like, get off my lawn.
Yeah, which is funny. It's funny to hear somebody like that in, the year 500. When you hear people like this now being like, oh, if teenagers didn't spend as much time on TikTok, it's like exactly that.
It's exactly that. It's literally like if they would stop gallivanting around and go to church more, all our problems would be solved.
So you've got, I don't know, and that's part of it. Like it feels it's the classic setup of three brothers, like just like in a fairy tale or something. There's kind of this boring older guy. The youngest one is really ambitious, and there's the middle one. But then in this, like Fredegund and Brunhild both make a name for themselves in the midst of all this chaos. So what is her role at this point when they're at war? Guntram comes in, the boring older brother, to sort of mediate, and he gives her the land. Is that what happens?
Well, I mean, essentially, he joins forces with Sigebert and is like, Chilperic, like, you went too far, like, you can't be doing this. And the two brothers, are essentially united and they're encircling, like, Chilperic's land. And it looks like he's going to lose, that they're going to take him down. And the deal between the two of them is obviously we're going to split up whatever he has between the two of us.
So, in general, when I'm reading history books and I get to the descriptions of battles and things, I'm just like, well, I'm just going to skip several pages until other things. But these battles are more interesting to me because everyone's just kind of like figuring it out as they go along. It's not just like a Napoleonic thing where it's like, oh, I'm just going to use this classic technique or whatever. And also just the weather is crazy. So there's these wild wars happen between them and the brothers, which ends with Sigebert coming out on top. He gets Paris, I think.
Yeah, and they've kicked Chilperic's on the run with Fredegund, and they've had to retreat to Tournai, which is on, in modern day Belgium on the water. It's a port city. I know that. Should check that. And so he's had to flee and kind of make a run for it and make like a last stand in essentially a bunker in this remote city. So they are like, if you could consider like, if we had like, how complete is this war? Like how mission accomplished are we? We're at like, 95% at this point.
So you're mentioning a bunker, and I'm like, is this where Fredegund gets the boys with the knives?
Yes. So at this point, like Sigebert and Brunhild have marched into Paris. And Paris, I should say, for the Merovingian brothers is like the city that everybody's supposed to split equally. But they're like, okay, me and Guntram have, we've conquered it. Like we're moving in and, expecting to be crowned like king of all of the Franks. Like that's the plan that, he's won such a decisive victory and his brother's on the run. And yes, Fredegund is giving birth in this bunker in Tournai. And this is when, yes, the poison knives come in. I'd like to remind everybody about those.
It's one of my favorite Fredegund moments. It's when she's just given birth, and I think her husband Chilperic is just be like, oh my God, what are we doing? We're not doing well. And she's just like, pull yourself together. And she's like just given birth in a bunker in the middle of a war. And then she gets these two servant boys and convinces them to go on literally a suicide mission because she has read these old books, presumably, and figured out how to get poison on knives, which is like a new thing. Like people haven't figured out how to keep. But if you've poison on your knife, you don't have to be as exacting when you stab.
Yeah, you get it in somewhere.
So she's just like immediately postpartum gets these two boys to agree to kill themselves. And they go and they assassinate Sigebert with these poison knives. And suddenly the tides turn for Chilperic and Fredegund.
Yes, completely. And I mean, this is essentially a victory camp. These guys are coming in, these boys ostensibly like to pay homage, where people are just pouring in to say, okay, this is our new king, and to crown Sigebert king of everything. And that's how they're able to sort of like get close to them. And like, again, they don't need to be successful. They just need to get close enough. They're taken out. It is a suicide mission, but they do their job. Sigebert falls, and Brunhild is waiting in Paris. At this point, there are kids because this war has gone on a while. She's waiting in Paris with her young kids, like expecting any day for the news to come that Chilperic's been finished off. Everything's good. They're king of everything. And instead, when the messengers come, it's completely opposite. So now, not only has she lost her father, her sister, now she's lost her husband, and she's the mother of these young children, and she's in Paris, and she knows that the opposing army is going to be coming and closing in any moment now. And she's got to figure out like what to do, because clearly, she's next.
Well, and also her boys, right? Like they would want to get rid of these heirs who would be a threat to take over.
So at this point, she's got 2 daughters and one son. And it's kind of amazing, I think. This is where I'm like, her ability to sort of scheme both of them, but under pressure. This is immense pressure. Fredegund's just had this crazy postpartum, like borderline psychosis, and somehow manages to pull off this assassination. And Brunhild's just had this shock, and it's been like one thing after another. And she's got to figure out how to keep her kids safe. And, what she does is she's able to smuggle the boy out of Paris. We don't know how accurate this is, but one version talks about how she lowers him in a basket out into the river, over into the River Seine, where he's picked up by a rowboat and taken to sea. And then she sends her daughters in other directions and gets them over the border. And she stays put with all of her wealth. And they're saying this is almost like something from the animal world, where it's this technique to essentially draw the predator towards you while your offspring have this chance to get away.
Yeah. Well, and part of the thing about her wealth was there with her. She kind of had to stay, because if it was going to be, right? Like she sort of stayed there to lure them in, but also because how is she going to transport that? Like it would be stolen.
Right. So there is that where it's, that's the problem, is they don't have cards or cashes. It's like large amounts of, heavy gold and booty and treasure and giant plates and chalices. So you need to we do have instances where we have like widows who are able to find people with a lot of horses and presumably a lot of trunks and pack it up in the dead of night and like go fast. But that was not going to happen. Or she might have been able to pull it off, but she had the kids to worry about too.
Well, and that's the thing. So like what Fredegund did, like they're both in shitty, awful situations. Fredegund, it's flashier. And that's where I'm just like, ooh, like, having a baby, convince these boys to like do this stabbing. But Brunhild, like and that's the thing, like Fredegund is flashier, but Brunhild is no less impressive what she pulled off. Like getting these kids free, staying there, it must have been terrifying. And then what she would have probably anticipated would happen is that she would be either killed or sent to a nunnery, which is kind of like where all the queens nobody knew what to do with were sent, which becomes a thing because it turns out they're all in the same nunnery. But but that's what happens, right? Is this the point where she's sent off to the nunnery?
She is sent off to the nunnery. I'm just laughing because I'm just thinking of this. Like, did the guys not put it together? Like, if we keep sending them all to the same spot, like they might talk. They might.
And they do. But this is where someone comes into the story. So Merovech, how do you pronounce that?
I say Merovech, but again, we can be very fluid with the pronunciation.
So can you explain who he is?
Sure. So Chilperic had a first wife that he got rid of for Fredegund. And then, although he, probably didn't marry Fredegund, and then sets Fredegund aside to marry Brunhild's sister. But this first wife, her name is Otavera, if we want to like confuse things with names more, but she has had sons. So that's the other puzzling thing, like why Chilperic would do this. Like, here's this woman, she's given him sons, everything's good. And he's just, no. But he has sent her to she's at the same convent as that Brunhild will end up with. And she happens to have a son of marriageable age, not that he's slightly younger than Brunhild, but Brunhild's still young, so a couple years younger. And the two women get to talking. And one solution is, well, you could marry my son. You're, I guess, technically your nephew by marriage. And you could have this secret marriage and you could launch a rebellion against Chilperic, because now we have, another son who might want this throne. So I think that's also some so you've gotten the kids out, then you're captive, and then you're going to plot a secret marriage, and then you're going to plot a rebellion, as one does.
This is where, like, what we were just saying, like, the fact that you're sending all these discarded queens who are all really smart and really bent on revenge to the same place, it's like, this is how, I don't know, in Batman or something, it's like, why would you send all the villains to the same prison? Like, of course they're going to come up with a plan together. So they come up with this plan that they're going to marry Brunhild, who's now a widow, to Merivek, which happens secretly by this bishop. This was something else when I was rereading this story. I was like, why do I recognize Praetextatus? I'm like, this is a name. And I'm like, oh, that's the guy who Fredegund later will murder in church.
And now why? Yeah, like why there's a bit of a grudge there.
Yeah. So Praetextatus. And part of the reason why he's doing this is because Brunhild, I think with her money, she's paying lots of people, nobles, to support her because she has all this money.
Yes. She has that money that she's kind of left behind. And she's kind of handed it off to the bishop to, take care of in her stead. And he's organizing things on her behalf. And the idea is that they're going to launch this huge rebellion. And Merivek is one of his, Chilperic is using him as a general. So I should mention that he's like a son that's in good. He's one of Fredegund's stepsons. She doesn't really like stepsons, but he, at this point, most of the fathers, if you have a son and he gets to a certain age, you put him in charge of an army. So Merivek's got his own army. He's been helping his father, fight what was Sigebert's army. But now they're saying, well, how about you go rogue and you fight against your father? And he's like, okay. And, part of that might also be like, well, Fredegund's in the picture. She has sons that she's going to want to put on, the throne. So this might be my one chance to kind of get her out of the way. Otherwise, I'm just always going to be this kind of second-rate stepson / general. So he has, something at stake as well. And then they're discovered. So, like it's crazy. It's like this rebellion is discovered. They managed to play it off. They convinced Chilperic, I don't know how, that this is a love match, that this has nothing to do with rebellion, but they're just, it's so smitten. Like Merivek was just so smitten by her. He just couldn't help himself. And they just had to get married. And he's like, okay, I'm a little skeptical of this. I'm going to separate you guys. I'll separate you because I don't want you to be married. But he's buying the story. And then, there's so many like events. I don't want to necessarily drag everyone down into the nitty gritty. But at some point, Chilperic realizes like, oh, this is a whole plan. Like, even though you're separated, like this is a whole thing where this marriage is really the pretext for you guys to take me out. And when he realizes that, things don't end well for Merivek, but they end up, Brunhild manages to yet again turn this to her advantage.
This is wild. Okay, can you walk me through? Because I was just like, did I miss a paragraph? Because Brunhild was sent to this nunnery. She did this scheme, like she married Merivek, and then it ends with her going back to Austrasia, and she's like the regent now.
Yeah, it's like essentially Chilperic separates them. And I don't even know what he's thinking at this point. And he gives her a choice. And he's like, you can stand by Merivek or you can go home. Because at this point, she's enough of a figure. He can't kill like both sisters, and Spain has gotten its act together.
Yeah.
He's like, you can go home and you can choose your children. I'll reunite you with your children and you go home. And she goes, okay. And he's so relieved that she'll leave that she's like, can I have all of my wealth too? Can I have that? And he says, are you leaving? And she says, yes. And he says, okay, yeah, she can have all of her wealth. Just go. He's just so happy to be rid of her.
It's just like, I would have expected him to be like, I'm going to keep you in this nunnery.
Maybe there's like a little overconfidence there, right? He's just one. He's like the king of everything. What's this woman going to do?
True. Yeah.
Just got these young kids. And so he sends her back. She's reunited with her kids. She has all this money. And even though she said she's going to leave Merivek, she doesn't desert him. Like she's spending all this time like sending like raiding parties to try to like rescue him. At some point, he's hiding even in Austrasia. He manages to escape. She helps him escape from her, his father. She keeps him hidden with an ally of hers. She's bankrolling his subsequent like attempts to rebel and, get rid of his father. And at one point, things do end badly with Merovec. Exit, kind of stage left Merovec. But at this point, Brunhild has somehow managed to not only like wiggle her way back in, but she's like, okay, but now I'm regent for my young son. So I'll just rule here. And the Austrasian, nobles are like, okay.
She must have been like just thinking, like looking at the sequence of events, so smart, but also so making herself seem non-threatening to get these men to agree to give her all these things, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing one thing we're going to see throughout Brunhild's career that I think is just something she has a talent for, she's incredibly loyal. And from the minute she arrives in Sigebert's court as a new bride, she builds this circle around her, of these like young, ambitious, but also like they're real intellectuals, they're kind of like poets and thinkers but also some like generals. And whatever was the nature of that, relationship, she must have had like this incredible force of personality. But these men are loyal to her to the end of her life, and she's very loyal to them. So, like, the people who she has in her corner believe that she will go kind of to the ends of the earth in their defense, and they behave similarly towards her. So throughout this, she would not have been able to pull this off if she hadn't been so good at making alliances when she first landed in this strange kingdom. Because through all of this all these twists and turns and crazy, machinations, she has these men behind the scene that she's able to like send money to or say, fund this here, fund this there, help me get across the border, help hide Merovec here. So it's really kind of a testament, I think, and we'll see this later, particularly with women, but to her ability to build relationships and to kind of pull everybody in and look out for everybody. And they become this like core group that really lasts for like 40, 50 years. It's pretty amazing.
That's so impressive to me, just especially in the context of earlier this year, I did a deep dive into Mary, Queen of Scots. And one of the things when she got to Scotland, she'd never had that. No one ever was there. Like she was similarly, like she came from far away. And then it's like, here's this court, but not having that support was a core reason why she didn't succeed as Queen of Scots. So Brunhild had that. So it's like, on the one hand, there were people there who she could count on, and that speaks well of them. But it also speaks well of Brunhild and her ability. Like Mary, Queen of Scots, couldn't read the room. When she first got there, she didn't know how the courtly stuff was playing out. But Brunhild clearly could kind of see what the factions were, who was like a young, ambitious, smart person who it'll make sense to ally with.
And her mother was a famed diplomat. Hopefully, like, we'll circle back to her. But I think that Brunhild had the advantage of sort of learning on her mother's knee, of seeing her kind of pull together. Her father became king as sort of a consensus candidate, and her mother was behind the scenes sort of whipping up the votes, so to speak. And so she learned and saw firsthand kind of how the sausage gets made politically, and had that advantage going in to know, okay, this is how you sort of wheel and deal in the back room and how you can forge these relationships that are going to be really helpful. That I don't think a lot of queens,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's so this is like, again, I'm just looking at these notes, which again is from Wikipedia, but it says not being a fighter, she was primarily an administrative reformer. So she was, in terms of politics, like Fredegund, I always think about as just like leading armies and scheming and manipulating, and that's what she needed to do where she was. But Brunhild came in with this political savvy and know-how, and that is, I think, one of the big differences between the two of them.
Yes. And also we have to keep in mind, Brunhild, like, for example, there's this time when one of these allies who helped her out with Merovec and helped her become regent. He has luckily one of the easier names, Duke Wolf. I was like, oh, thank
Whenever I saw that, can I tell you, I don't know if you know, at the end of Law and Order, it's always like executive producer, Dick Wolf. And so whenever I read in your book, I'm just like, executive producer, Dick Wolf.
Well, executive producer, Duke Wolf.
Yeah.
But he's pretty amazing. But there's this one point where he's being ambushed by like this rival noble faction, and he's outnumbered. And Brunhild arms herself. The sources are very specific and clear about this, and puts with the full on, like, as a man, they say, and with the sword and everything, and goes out and stands in between the two armies. So puts her actual physical body on the line. And if you kind of imagine what that's like, particularly when these men are on horseback and they're armed to the teeth and they have throwing axes, and there's got to be some psychopaths in the bunch, because this is what they do for a living, is just murder. But she goes out on the field and stands in front of and defends her allies. So we also see that sends a message to every other ally, where they see, well, Duke Wolf did this for her, but she will go to the mat for him. So that risk she took not only helped defend her ally, but I think also sent a message that, like, when we have an alliance, I'm good for it. I'm not going to turn my back on you.
That just sort of like the medieval PR of that, just that instinctive knowledge that, like, by doing this, it's going to reverberate. People are going to say that I did this. They'll see me doing this, and that will send a message. This is how loyal I am. This is why it's if I'm on your side, you have to stick with me. That was the part, this was a while ago, but one of the podcast listeners was reading your book, and then their daughter was like, wanted to hear it as a bedtime story. And I think that was the part that they read.
That's the most child-friendly portion of their story.
Just hearing about this brave woman going out and implementing peace, really, by just standing there. Yeah. But anyway, back to the murders. So, so what happened next? Oh my gosh. So the thing so she convinced Guntram. So Guntram didn't have children, question mark?
No. And he had them. This is part of the reason he's such a stick in the mud. And when he was younger, he had like this series of like wives and mistresses who all fight, and one poisons the other's kids, and his kids died. I think he got religion and was like, wow, I better shape up, because that went badly. So I'm swearing off, women and wine, and I'm just going to go to church and lecture other people. So he had children at one point, and he has a daughter, I should say. But women don't always count for much in that. And Guntram is old school. He's, not seeing his daughter as his heir. So it's odd to say they have no children. Like, he has no male children, no surviving male children. And he, Brunhild manages to get him to agree that he will make her son his heir. So when he dies, her son will inherit both kingdoms, 2 out of 3.
Which is amazing. We hear later on how Fredegund kind of manipulates Guntram by being like, oh no, I'm just a poor woman. Like, won't some man help me? And then she gets what she wants. So I have to imagine Brunhild is doing, to get Guntram to do what she wants, she'd have to play up like, oh, if only a man would adopt my son as his heir, like, to convince him.
Yes, and you were so good to his brother, and it would mean so much to my dead husband. Like, whatever shall I do? Absolutely.
But this is a major, like, in this long-standing, now years-long battle between these brothers and these kingdoms. Like, this is major for Brunhild to have her son, the one who escaped in the basket out the window down the river or whatever, named as the heir to 2 kingdoms, is massive. Yeah.
Huge, absolutely.
And kind of an act of war, one might say.
Yes, certainly one could say that. Would be perceived that way.
Yeah. So this is like, it's like the stealthy, like, Fredegund is like, I don't know, it's just like flashy, like assassinations. And Brunhild is just kind of like so clever and so smart, but low key, but just as devastating in her own way. So then her daughter Ingunda was married to a Visigothic prince, which connects her kingdom with her homeland.
Yeah, so here's where I think Brunhild's mother and kind of comes in, and Brunhild's ability, we talked about like her forming these loyal networks, but her networks with other women are what I think really set her apart as a monarch. And why this is really fascinating is if we talk about her mother, Goiswintha, for a moment.
Please, you've been wanting to this whole time.
I'm like, let me just keep bringing it back to Goiswintha.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm gonna do a little arm twisting here. But what's fabulous about Goiswintha is that she has been her husband, the king's number one advisor. And she has two daughters, and the daughters are raised to be the heirs. There are no male children, and they're like, well, we're going to train them up to be the heirs. And then there's a point where her husband has died, and she marries the next king, his successor. And what's amazing about this is she's menopausal. She's not having any more kids. He doesn't marry her to have heirs. And in fact, he has sons already from a previous marriage from a woman who's died. So what he's marrying her for is, her political acumen, like to, bring the kingdoms together. And she has the stepsons, and she's able to turn one of the stepsons against his father. And she's like, we're going to split what is Spain in half and have our own kingdom. And I'm going to marry my granddaughter, Brunhild's, daughter, to him. So there's like 3 generations of women. We've got Brunhild, Brunhild's mother, and Brunhild's daughter that are all working together. And their plan is that they're going to have this portion of Spain, and then the lands that Chilperic had given to Gauswintha, and then she died, and now Brunhild is claimed as her own. Those are going to be the lands. And they're envisioning like this, like basically forming their own kingdom, like these 3 women. And I think that is just, you think of that's beyond like cheeky. Like that's kind of revolutionary, right? I mean, these women who are ready to not just work behind the scenes or step in as regents, but are kind of conceiving of having their own kingdoms, and they're going to connect them through the women. And what's fascinating too is even when that falls apart, Goiswintha is able to get the next stepson, and she's like revolted against her husband, like had armed revolt against her husband. Like now this is the second time, she has a second try with the next stepson. And eventually, that one fails as well. And she ends up in jail as an old woman or sent to a convent. And then we hear that it sounds like she commits suicide from the sources. They're a little unclear. But you imagine, I think that's so telling about kind of who Brunhild is, to imagine this woman as her mother that's married to 2 kings, leads 2 rebellions, and then rather than sit around in a convent is like, that's enough, I'm out.
Well, this makes me think about, this is skipping ahead, but like eventually, once Brunhild and Fredegund are both dead, and then the men who are left behind are like, no one can ever know women were this powerful ever, because then they'll know that it's possible.
Yeah.
But that's like that, like Brunhild saw her mother do this, so she knew it was possible. She knew, like, if people don't see that, and I don't just mean being a queen in oldie times, but like if you don't see someone doing a thing, you don't know you can do it. So
absolutely. And you know what? If Brunhild's daughter unfortunately dies of in a plague, but had she survived, or we think about how many other like repercussions we have. But even Brunhild, we know like she forms relationships with her daughter-in-law and her niece. And so she's constantly, the women, I think what's so heartening is they don't see themselves as isolated actors. Like they see it as completely possible that they can band together and affect change, and that they can rule with one another's help. And that's what kind of really blew my mind when I was doing the research to see the evidence of that. There's this great treaty that'll come along a little later, but the Treaty of Andelot, where Brunhild's signing it as an equal party to men, but a third of that treaty is devoted to women. And it's her saying, in order to sign this, you have to promise me, my daughter-in-law, my niece, that we keep our property. You can never put us in a convent. You can't tell us what to do. And our heirs can't be told what to do with their property. So essentially carving out sort of an independent path, not just for themselves, but for the next generation, that they have that foresight. A lot of people are in it for themselves or for the immediate, but that they're definitely thinking long term.
Well, and this is where, again, like your book is called The Dark Queens. It's about two different people, but I think this is a major difference between, just the more we're talking, the more like I see how Fredegund and Brunhild are so different as people. But Fredegund, you never hear about her siding with women. And I mean, maybe there weren't people around there. She didn't have the familial connections because she was enslaved and stuff.
Well, and I think too, I mean, some of it could just be the sources might be a little biased just because of what survived and what hasn't. So, we have to assume that Fredegund is also able to pull off some of what she pulls off, whether that's catching the king's eye, whatever. You'd have to have female servants help you. You have to have people say he's going to be here at this time or happen. And she obviously had a lot of male servants who were willing to go on suicide missions for her. But, there certainly have to be other women. And we know of a few more minor instances. So we don't know just because she's not titled. And in Brunhild's case, the women that she is kind of colluding with happen to be more illustrious, happen to be like princesses or queens or, kind of royal cousins. So there's just happens to be more of a royal record. But I do think this is pretty unique. And the fact too, that like when she's corresponding, she'll correspond to, the female regent of Byzantium, or she's constantly forming these networks with like a former mother-in-law with Radegund. So with like multiple generations of women. And so it's not just younger women, for example, they're reaching out. She really has this, seems that she has a handle or a kind of a concept of what women can do if they work together. And we see that in the convent when she works with, kind of the former ex-queen.
The First Wives Club, yeah.
First Wives Club. But we see it over and over again. And I think that was one thing that has really been written out of history. And to see that evidence it's just really, it's heartening. It also makes me so angry that we've been sort of robbed of that idea that there was not just a single powerful woman or a pair of powerful female rivals, but there were these kind of entire groups of women. It also makes you kind of understand how centuries later people will be so terrified of these like cabals of like women, of witches or whatever, because, there is this precedent for groups of women being able to affect real change.
That's so, I can only imagine when you were researching to start putting this all together and realize this is what was going on. Because I've covered so many queens and royal women on my podcast, and I can't remember anything like this. Like the closest I can think of is maybe Catherine de Medici. I know that she was pen pals with like people in the Ottoman Empire and things like that. And she had her kind of flying squadron of lady spies,
which is awesome.
Which this kind of reminds me of a bit. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. And it also feels very modern in a way. And that's what's funny, because I think there's this overall impression that things used to be bad for women and they've been getting better steadily ever since, which is false, because things have been good and bad and up and down and whatever. But this is like the year, whatever, 550 or something. And like this is happening. And she's like, anyway, this is why your book is so important. And I'm glad that you were able to read these ancient manuscripts in, I'm sure, terrible handwriting.
Some of the scribes had great handwriting, but yeah, others not so much.
Yeah, that's where I'm appreciative to anyone, like to you specifically for this, but to anyone, the historians who do this stuff, so I can read a nice typeset book that summarizes what these ancient documents said. Okay, so Chilperic dies. Wait, no, yes. No, wait. Sorry, the names are confusing to me.
Her son. Are you talking about Brunhild's son, Childebert?
Yes, maybe.
Yeah.
And let me think. So Brunhild there's this thing, she tries to do this thing, marrying her daughter. That doesn't work. She ruled Austrasia until Childebert came of age, but then she kind of kept on ruling.
Yes, that was what's amazing is like there's a royal pair that goes on barges, and her son is married. We should add this, okay? He's like married with kids. And we don't know how her daughter-in-law feels about her, but I mean, she looks out for her daughter-in-law, and her daughter-in-law, in fact, helps her foil a coup. So there's obviously, even if they hate each other personally, like some loyalty there. They look out for one another. But her daughter-in-law, like when there's the royal pair, it's mother and son. Like his wife doesn't appear. It's the two of them. And one fabulous tidbit I found was that when people were executed or imprisoned for forgery, it was always Brunhild's signature and seal and not her son's. So even when they're supposedly co-rulers and they signed everything together, it was like both of their names. Oftentimes, hers was first. But that people, it kind of tells you something if the criminals know, like, well, you really need to learn how to forge mom's signature, not the king's signature, like where the power lies.
This is also very Catherine de Medici coded, because she, her three of her adult sons were the king, but kind of she was really in charge.
Kind of not, yeah.
Technically, maybe, yeah. So this is where, okay, so it seems like in this era, in these kingdoms, things can never just be okay for any long period of time. Eventually, it's like, okay, things are good. Someone's going to be like, are they though?
Yeah. It's like you just got like the harvest in and you were going to relax and take a nap. Nope.
So this is where some of the dukes conspired to assassinate her son, but the plot was discovered. And this is where they went to join Guntram. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the factions are incredibly kind of complicated in terms of the different factions at court, and Brunhild's some of her allies end up being forced out into Guntram's territory in order to sort of keep the peace, or to be keep their heads, I guess, attached, where she can't guarantee their safety. Things have gotten that kind of hairy, but that Duke's revolt in some ways is foiled by her daughter-in-law, and that's like a great story. How her daughter-in-law, I mean, you think of the loyalty, is recovering from a horrific childbirth, and it seems as though the baby has died and she's been unconscious or injured. So it seems like there's been like a lot of blood loss, or it's not really clear. But people presume that she's unconscious and she overhears something. They're not as careful. And she drags her bleeding self from the bed. It says, that she can't walk, but to her mother-in-law to say, look, like this is going down. Like there's this going to be this attempt on your life and my husband's life. And she's able to stop it.
That's like days of our lives,
Right? There's no way. Like your editor would say, come on, this is ridiculous. That's why it's so over the top and kind of ridiculous that I know you're going over the Chronicles, you'd have to be like, this can't be right. And like kind of over it and over it, because it is like a soap opera. It's ridiculous.
I don't know. It just feels like the next thing that's going to happen is like someone's long lost twin comes in and then they switch place. Like everyone thinks you're unconscious, but you overhear. Anyway, this is what I mean when I was reading it, and I was just like screen capture every page. I'm like, this is a great story. This is a great story. I'm like, and what a gift to you as a writer to be able to be the one who writes this down. Because you don't have to make it up. It's there.
There.
But you're right. An editor would be like, let's tone this down.
Like there's a little too much, like a little too many of the assassinations. And we should mention too, throughout this time, like Fredegund is sending assassins constantly. And there's this one fabulous scene where, I mean, Brunhild sends them back, like with their they're a package that she sometimes she cuts off their hands, but she sends them back to Fredegund. I think it's almost this like nice try.
Yeah,
like do better next time.
That was where this is the era where I just think of like the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, where it's just like trying and trying and trying, but Brunhild's just like, no, it's not going to happen. And Fredegund is like, this is my one move, sending boys with poison knives. I don't have a plan B. Okay, so then we have or did we already get to this? So the Pact of Andalot, which secured the succession. We talked about that. Anyway, so then Guntram died, and Brunhild's son, Childebert, succeeds to the kingdom, immediately making war on Fredegund's son, who is overseeing Neustria. So this is sort of like and your book gets into the story itself. It's just like we're getting into sons, then we're into grandsons, then we're into great-grandsons. And that's where they start naming people after previous people. And my little brain. How did you even write it, honestly?
It was really hard. And I do know there was one point where I talked to my editor. I was like, can we just give them nicknames? And I was like, no. But, I do think if anybody ever does this, it's like fiction or whatever, like that would be nice. There's a point too where like all of the grandkids have the same, their names all start with like there's Thudebert, and even the girl. So it was like, are you kidding me? Can we just call them like T-Bert? And, but that seemed a little too contemporary. But
this is like in on TV, The Spanish Princess, which is based on the Philippa Gregory book. You've got Margaret Beaufort, and then you have Margaret Pole, and she's Maggie, and then you have Margaret Tudor, and she's Meg. Like they had to, yeah.
Right. But like, I was like, what is can you make Thudebert like Teddy? That would be lovely. It would have made things so much easier.
Yeah. So the names, and I'm going to say, honestly, whoever wrote this Wikipedia confused some of these names when I'm trying to read this. But so we're at war. It's like Fredegund is kind of regent for her son. Brunhild is regent for her son. And now it's their sons are going to war. But really, it's the two women are kind of in charge of both places. So war yet again. Let's see. Childebert, Brunhild's son, dies age 26. I think in battle.
No, actually, so this is one of those mysterious deaths. Like every time you're like, okay, we've had sort of a peaceful transfer of power, like Guntram's died of old age. I mean, that's kind of a rarity. And there's a will and it's very clear. Brunhild's son takes over. Everybody's like, phew, relief, right? Nope. So he dies and his wife dies, but it seems as though it's natural causes. And, the reason for that is twofold. It's not in battle. It's very sudden. The fact that his wife dies as well is significant, but also no one, we do have a lot from like this time period. There's not like a gap in the records and no one mentions it. They just say that he died. But because we have such this kind of history and habit of turning any sort of mysterious death into a rallying cry for potential war and invasion, this person was assassinated. It seems as though, I mean, if there was a hint of poison or this or that they would have made the most of that. That would have really helped sort of the propaganda and public relations campaign. But for all intents and purposes, it's pretty interesting. It's like, and Childebert died, but essentially everything stayed the same because Brunhild was in charge, and now Brunhild's back in charge as official regent for her grandkids now.
Yeah.
Really hasn't been that big of a shakeup. It's just the name of the guy that she's representing has changed.
Yeah, so this is her grandson's Theudebert. So Theudebert became king of Austrasia and Theuderic, her other grandson, king of Burgundy. And these are the ones with identical looking names.
Yes.
This is what it says here. Peace would elude the Franks for many years more.
That's a bit of an understatement.
I would say that's the permanent state of things. Okay, so what happens here? So her elder grandson, Theudebert, she was staying at his court and he exiled her. Why did he do that?
So essentially there's a lot of factions. There's her kind of core group. And then there's this more sort of, they're fundamentalist. And there's also like this group that is based in what we would now call kind of Switzerland that really are, I hate to use like modern terms, but they're very close to what we would consider now like the libertarians. They don't want to pay taxes for the people in the city. They don't understand why they should like contribute to the common defense. Why should they pay for someone's road over here? Why do they have to pay taxes at all? And so they're essentially kind of like pushing back. And they're able to sort of get their claws into her oldest sort of grandson. And so she leaves, it's not great terms, and goes south, goes into Guntram's kingdom and decides she's going to kind of set up shop there, favoring the younger grandson.
Well, and this is where there are stories that are not true that are like, she was found out wandering.
Yeah, and you know what she does is she goes to the city that's called Autun, and she goes on this huge building spree. Like she's on an infrastructure project where she's like, okay, I'm going to repair the roads. And she wants to build herself this like incredible city. And there's still ruins today, but of like the churches and the hospitals and the things that she starts building. So she's not kind of cast out and wandering around. This is more of a strategic move of like, okay, I'm not really getting along with the older grandson and his new wife. And his advisors. So I'm going to go with the younger one and sort of our worldviews are aligning a little bit better. And I'm going to set up shop down here.
But then, like, as per ever, the two brothers, which are her two grandsons, the brothers of each other, go to war against each other because this story is one of unrelenting wars between brothers. So, okay. So tell me what happens next.
I mean, essentially, we have these two brothers in a war. Another thing I want to bring into, because we were talking about like the next generation, is Brunhild does set up an alliance with her granddaughter and installs her in kind of this palace to kind of keep an eye on this separate area of the territories. So she's still always building like alliances. constantly. So I mentioned that she goes on the building spree. She has this new church. She has a new convent. And so this whole idea that the whole story that Brunhild was like kind of kicked out, and this idea that like the grandsons are fighting, it's hard to know. I guess we have to sort of like dig through all of that. So she goes with Theuderic, and part of the reason for that is he's willing to let her operate the same way that her son did. And the ambassadors address them as like Queen Brunhild and King Theuderic.
Right. So like her basically in charge, him just kind of also there. Yeah.
And he also, instead of marrying like a really strong-headed woman, keeps having like concubines who have kids. What that means that there's heirs, there's a lot of sons, but he's unmarried, so she can kind of continue as queen. So she's operating exactly as she used to. This is also the period where, rather than sort of being cast out, Brunhild also forms an alliance with the Pope Gregory, and Christianizes Britain, which I just want to mention because I think it's going to, in terms of like significance, like if she doesn't do this and Kent, doesn't become Christian, like this alters, like, I think for those of us in North America, kind of like how things affect, us here now today. And she's also like holding church councils. So that's really important. And there's this great move where she even takes up a powerful bishop. He would be like today the equivalent of an archbishop, and has like a rape allegation, and has him brought up on rape charges against like a noblewoman, which I think is sort of, again, we have this idea of Brunhild forming these alliances or rallying with other women. And so she's fighting, but at this point in time, she's obviously like earned herself some enemies in the church as well, because I don't really like it if you kind of, not only is she good friends, buddy with like the Pope, that's kind of alarming, but she's also kind of going after this really powerful archbishop. And at this point in time, there's this new kind of strain of Christianity that's creeping into Francia. And it's coming from Ireland, like the Irish sort of monasteries. And they're known for like lots of corporal punishment. They love beating themselves. And they decide that they want to come into Francia and into continental Europe and found more monasteries that are based on this model. And they're, what we would essentially consider to be like kind of more fundamentalist, and they're really heavy-handed. Pope Gregory, when he's sending out, and Brunhild, when they're sending out their missionaries, their goal is like, you go in, you find the local traditions and you adopt. So if there's a pagan temple, you're like, this is cool. Who's your pagan goddess? Okay, well, we could also call that person, like St. Margaret. And you could just do the same thing and you could just call it St. Margaret's Day. And they'd say, okay. Whereas when this strain comes in, and there's this one monk, Columbanus, he just burns their churches down. He just finds like their favorite trees and burns them down. And then he's like, why are they getting in fights with me? And, like, why do I keep getting in trouble? But then they also start this whole thing, this group, they're already kind of mad at Brunhild. And they're like, you're letting your grandson live in sin with all of these concubines. And you have this like luxurious lifestyle and you're not supporting us. And they're ganging up with these like anti-tax people in the mountains. So if you want to picture these sort of fundamentalist monks and Christians and this sort of like anti-big government, coalition, and they've decided like, ooh, Brunhild's a bit of a problem. Like, we don't like the power she has. We don't like what she's telling us to do. Let's have a tax rebellion. Like, let's get rid of her.
She's been so influential and so successful for so long. Just no one else has been. No one else has lived that long. Like, usually when someone is this powerful in this place and time, they get assassinated. So it's impressive that she lasted as long as she did.
It is. And I mean, she's still doing this. You got to keep in mind, like, at this point, like, we're like mid 50s, and then she's in her 60s. And then it's like, this is it's just a long life period. I mean, given there's no clean water or kind of, regular like doctor visits, and she hasn't died in childbirth, but also just in terms of like the wars. But she's still like kind of managing to keep her head on top. There's the tax rebellion that's like pitting kind of grandson against grandson. And I guess, at one point, her grandson, I was saying through Derek, both the grandsons are going to end up dead. And then we're getting down to great grandsons.
Which is the second Sigebert.
Yes.
Sigebert in the story, number 2. So this is, at this point, Brunhild is now regent of her great grandson.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Catherine de Medici wishes that she, yeah. Okay, so so she made it through this tax rebellion and everything.
And the deaths of both grandsons. And so there's 4 great-grandchildren left behind. They're all really, really young. They're all minors still. So she's thinking, maybe what I can do is the oldest boy, this Sigebert, he's like 11. What if he rules the the kingdoms by himself? We can kind of up his age. He'll be of age, which would be like 15 pretty soon. And she's like, so don't be worried. I'm just going to be regent, but just for a couple more years, because it's just this one guy. I won't let the younger ones. They're so young. So he'll just take over. We'll just go to a single heir so we don't have to keep splitting everything up. We'll just have this one boy, and I'm just going to be regent for a couple more years. So you don't really have to worry. And this is the point where Fredegund's son is like, I'm going to ally myself with some of the people that were dissatisfied with Brunhild, and we're going to try to take her out together.
So this is the thing. So Brunhild has been for the last several decades, through her son, grandson, she's been ruling over Austrasia and Burgundy, but Fredegund's son has been ruling over Neustria. Is that right?
Yes.
So I was just kind of starting to feel like, oh, Brunhild's in charge of all of them. But no, they're still Fredegund's son.
And they've been steadily chipping away at that kingdom. So it's really small. It's kind of down to what we would consider to be Normandy and France and a little adjoining area. So it's kind of a sliver of a kingdom at this point. And she seems to be ruling, all of it.
Right. So then we've got so this is Fredegund's from beyond the grave revenge, one might say. So through her son. So her son teams up with the anti-Brunhild people. And is this where she's taken captive and put on trial?
Yeah. So essentially, and the interesting thing is we have a bishop and a noble who say, we're going to invite Clothar, that's Fredegund's son, to come rule us instead. And they wouldn't be able to pull this off, though, if it wasn't for the treachery of kind of an inside man. So she's been able to count on Brunhild, these loyal folks, for so long, and they've started dying off, and she's had to kind of replenish the ranks. And one of these guys is hey, great grandkids, ride out with the army. I'm right behind you. And then they're in this sticky situation. And then they realize the whole army has turned and left them, on their own. And so they're able to capture the princes, 3 of the 4. And also they're able to capture Brunhild and Brunhild's granddaughter. So most of the royal family is rounded up. What's really, I think, fascinating too is there is this lost prince. There's always a lost prince, isn't there, in fairy tales? But he's able to get away, and they spend so much time and energy trying to hunt this boy down, and he simply disappears. But it seems as though he gets out of town because we can sort of track track where he went by the people who are arrested for helping him. But, he never turns up. But we know there's one of these grandsons, a 10-year-old, who somehow, the sources say, mounts a horse and fled, never to return.
And that's, we never find him, but that could have turned into, those guys who showed up to be I'm actually the princess in the tower.
Yes.
Some sort of fake Anastasia could have shown up at some point to be and in this Days of Our Lives saga, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. Anyway, so she's captured. The royal family is captured. The boys, her grandchildren, are killed, or the girl is sent away and the boys are killed?
The girls are sent away, and he's gotten 3 of the 4. And of those 3, he executes 2 of them and sends one of them. He keeps one in reserve because you got to always have a spare just in case dysentery takes out all the men again. So 2 of the great grandsons are killed. her granddaughter is shut away in a convent, and then they are going to decide what they're going to do with Brunhild, who at this point is a very old queen.
She's in her 70s, I think.
Yeah. Late 60s, early 70s.
And so she was accused of the death of 10 kings of the Franks.
Yes. And some of those are people that Fredegund, like Clothar's mother, had killed. So, it's kind of like everything gets laid at her feet.
Well, and some of them are people who just died in battle or of natural causes. So it's like every king who has recently died, she was accused of personally murdering.
Because, we're going to just wrap it all up with a bow. Be like, everything was her fault. And once we get rid of her, there are sunnier days ahead.
Well, and also it's a way for Clothar to clear his mother's name, Fredegund, because if he wants his reputation to be clean, then it can't be like, well, you're the son of the woman who did all these things.
Right. Very good point.
Well, and that's why, the whole Fredegund being buried, and it's like, she was the mother of a king. It's like really cleaning away some of what she did to make him seem better. And basically, it's a show trial. Like, this is not, she's not going to be found innocent of this.
No.
She is found guilty, and a camel shows up, and she is executed in fairly dramatic circumstances.
This is incredibly dramatic. And in fact, it might be the most brutal execution of a queen that we know of. So first, on a camel, it's like, why would they even, they have to go and get this camel, right? It's not as though there's camels just running around, battlefields of Francia.
And you say that, sorry, in your book, you mentioned, you're like, this is the one detail all of the retellings say. Like, they all say it's a camel. So it's not just like someone misinterpreted. They all say specifically camel. Yeah.
But the thing that is really interesting is like from Egypt to Byzantium, they would take, when they were deposing a king. So this is a king's death that she's going to endure, which is really interesting. They would have them be paraded around on a camel facing backwards. And it was the opposite of when an emperor rode triumphant into a city, he came in. And so this was them like, we are symbolically like showing you the door. And even where she came from, they would sometimes do this with a donkey, but particularly like the Byzantine Empire did this with a camel. So they got the camel and they made her ride it backwards. And, it was in a way, too, to show that she's foreign, really to point to her foreign roots. Like, this is not a Frankish woman. We're not going to do a Frankish ceremony on her. We're going to do what these like strange people in the East do with their, with their kings. And so, they've also tortured her at this point when they take her out. They've tortured her for 3 days. And so we know that they say that she's like a quote, sorry spectacle. So, we know she's a great grandmother and we know she's been tortured. We'd assume that, she's not looking like she's in really good shape, that they've done something to her to like physically sort of demean or embarrass her. And then they tie her. The sources differ on this, but she's tied to a horse. Some say the hooves, some say tails, some say, and how she's bound. Is it just she's bound by arms and legs? Some people say it's her hair, one arm and one leg. So the sources are all kind of hazy on.
Well, here's the thing. You're seeing this happen. Like, can you fully take in what you're seeing?
It's so ridiculous. And, she's essentially killed. She's ripped to death by wild horses. So she's tied to these horse or horses, and they give the signal, give the horse a smack, and it gallops across this like rocky terrain, and that's the end of Brunhild. But even worse, so she's obviously not in good shape when they have her body, but then they make sure, they say, her final grave was the fire, her bones were burnt. So not only is she dead, but they make sure they can't have a body. There can't be a martyr. There can't be a tomb. She is literally obliterated, completely obliterated.
So that's like Fredegund. There's still, and a couple people who listen to the podcast have visited where Fredegund is buried, and they've sent me pictures, and I'm so touched and so excited when I see it. But Brunhild, there's not a place to visit for her.
There's part of her sarcophagus, and there's kind of the remains of this church. So the church itself, there was a crypt. She had built herself a tomb in this crypt in a church that she built in that city of Autun. And it had all these marble columns. And there are sketches that were made of it before the crypt itself was destroyed during the Revolution. But it seems that somebody who was at that execution scooped up her ashes, because it was just ashes that were found there, and put it in, the sarcophagus. That people still created some sort of a tomb, or at least that's what it was. That's what was relayed. And the thing we have to keep in mind too is now looking back with, we know who won, and so with the benefit of hindsight, it's like, oh, Clothar wins. But at the time, people didn't know. I mean, they don't know if that other great grandson is going to show back up. And there's a lot of opposition. So there are a lot of records saying, there are bishops who are rebelling. There are, kind of other forces. There are sort of these nobles who are banding together trying to get rid of Clothar. And he, there's assassination attempts against him. There's people pushing back. So it's not as though Brunhild is like left alone and friendless. It's, she definitely has allies. She has people on her side, but the timing, they're not able to, get there. There's no like rescue party, like the movie kind of coming in and saving the day. But you can still go. It's a really small museum in Autun. And I went there, and the slab of her marble sarcophagus, not her remains, is there. And you can kind of touch it and see it.
So many things in this keep kind of tweaking just because I've been like going so deep in Mary, Queen of Scots this whole year. But like, it's similar. When she was executed, they burned her clothes. They didn't want any speck of blood that could be turned into a relic, that could be turned into anything that would make her seem like a martyr. So it seems like it's a similar thing where it's just like, we need to erase all trace of this person. Yeah.
And then that's what they do. I mean, they go through the historical records. They were like, just simple things like taxes, not saying she was great, but just like, it's like those years never existed. They just take it right out.
We're going to get into the scoring shortly, but why is the name Brunhild well known? Like, there's an opera or something?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's both women's stories are kind of co-opted into this amalgam, but that kind of composite character is usually named Brunhild. And so that's pretty interesting. And I don't know if that's just because that was like the forbidden name, or that she was slightly better known because she lived a little longer than.
Right, Fredegund, yeah.
There's also this idea too that like she has, like roads named after her. Like when I was in France, like you can still ride on a road and they're named after her. The French version of Brunhild, but like you can go ride on these roads, so that because she was such like in terms of building empire,
right?
But she built things. There were still, even though they got rid of her, things, places, roads that were associated with her, that one wonders if that's kind of why her name lived on.
Well, there's that thing I can see behind you just in the video. You have like one of those hats with the horns on.
Yeah.
Like what's that connection? Like before I read your book, before I knew anything about anything, Brunhild, somehow in my head, I was like, oh yeah, the hat with the horns, like the Viking lady
Absolutely.
in the opera. Like, what is that?
And that's exactly like how I encountered that too. I have to tell you, like that hat you see with the horns was something I had bought for a Halloween costume. And, when I was like, stumbled across the story of Brunhild and Fredegund and source material, I was like, wait, is that opera horn helmet lady? And I was like, it is, and was kind of completely blown away. I think part of that is the story that gets attached to Brunhild. Fredegund's essentially kind of erased. They're like, let's make her nice, let's make her pretty. She's the mother of a king, and we'll keep her around, but in this very sanitized version. Brunhild is like, she's really bad. She's bad. She rips, if you vote for her, if you go with her, if you ally yourself with her, she'll rip the kingdom apart. And then there becomes these like characters that are like, oh, they end up, their choices and in the myths and the folklore that they are used in becomes this woman who, what she does can rip the kingdom apart, and essentially her story becomes kind of grafted onto these Norse legends.
So what I want to, again, like I sent you, just so the listeners know, I sent you an explanation of the scoring categories, and I also let you know how Fredegund scored so that you know kind of what, not that we necessarily always want to compare the two against each other, but just so you know, like where the gauge is. But I didn't tell you this before, but there is, when I do these episodes, if there's somebody who is really helpful. So there's an award I give called the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance. And that's if there's a person in the story who was like a real one, who is like really there. Cause I've done 100 and something episodes. There's like 6 people on this list. Like most of the people I talk about don't have someone in their corner. Is there anyone who you feel from Brunhild's story would be this? And I feel like her mom might be this.
Her mom, oh my gosh, there's almost too many, which I think is going to be problematic because they can't all get it. I think her mom is pretty amazing. And there's also Fredegund, who there's like a new book out by E.T. Daly, by the way, that just details her life.
There's not, is there? Because I was reading your book and I was like, I'm obsessed with Fredegund.
There is a brand new book and it's out with the University of Oxford. And I wish I had it upstairs with me, but I have it downstairs. I can send you a copy of the cover, but it's just out and it's marvelous.
Listeners, I will 100% put a link to that in the show notes because I was Fredegund. I was just like, I want to know more about her. Okay.
Yeah. So I feel like Fredegund is also like this rebellious queen. We didn't even touch her story, but who really helps Brunhild when she first lands there and proves to be like kind of a real ally and goes toe to toe and advocates for her behalf, with the Byzantines. And I think sets this course of what a Frankish ex-queen can manage, but certainly seems as closest to, she has this really powerful mother in Spain, but she also kind of has this mother figure in Frank who helps sort of set her up.
I have in this category, like I've got, for some of them, I have like this person's whole family is on here. So I could just say Fredegund and Goiswintha for her. Yeah, for Brunhild.
Kind of pseudo mother-in-law.
Yeah, listeners, like I will 1,000% do a Fredegund episode later because just the part of her story that's in your book, I was just like, I didn't remember this from before, but this is iconic behavior. I'll say one thing, which is she was married to this guy she didn't want to be married to. And so she just really embraced religiosity in a really aggressive way where she would be like, he's like, time to go to bed, wife. And she would be like lying on the floor, like in a hair shirt, like screaming out prayer, like until he was like, let's just send you to a nunnery. And then she was like, great. And then she took over the nunnery and was like a power player. She's like a queen in the nunnery. Anyway, it's a great story.
It is a great story. So definitely having those kind of female queens in her corner, huge help, huge bonus point.
Definitely. And this is where I like to recognize people who help out because, again, it's not often. A lot of people are just kind of stranded out there on their own doing the best they can. And so it's nice when somebody helps somebody. Okay, so the categories. Just to recap for everybody, if you're listening to this and you haven't heard the Fredegund episodes, just so you know, Fredegund, a perfect score in this is 40. Fredegund continues to have the highest score anyone has ever gotten, which is 38 out of 40. And I, in fact, renamed this whole thing as the Fredegund Memorial Scandiliciousness Scale in her honor because I felt bad I didn't give her a 40.
And we've got like scandiliciousness, right? Scheminess, significance, and sexism. I have to tell you, I found scandiliciousness the most difficult. So maybe can we put that one last, like discuss?
Definitely. You know what? Let's start with what I think is an easy one, which is significance.
Yes.
In terms of what she did for how long, the fact there was roads named after her still. But can you explain where you would score her for significance?
I would do 9 out of 10. And here's why. So first recorded female judge in like Western history, check mark. Christianizing Britain, like instrumental in that, check mark. Roads, city, check mark. As you said, like long-term diplomacy, tons of treaties, alliances, all of it. I think her significance is huge. And the only reason, and I mean, still is impacting our lives today. The only reason I'm saying 9 out of 10 is because I think, she has been erased, or at least like her tale has been, I guess, certainly twisted and perverted in terms of how it's been passed down to us in history. Although I still think she has more brand name recognition than Fredegund. People don't know necessarily who she is, but they're like that name. They've heard something about it. Is she in an opera? What's that woman? So she's somehow managed to survive. And if you consider that's been 1400 years, I'm like, that's pretty amazing.
No, and so in this category, Fredegund got an 8. So I think it makes sense that what Brunhild, like, even just to really explain to people so they understand the significance, like, Brunhild is the one who sent the person to England to start making that country have Christians in it, which shaped all of English history, like the schism, Protestant and Catholic, and then like the Puritans coming to America. Like, someone else might have done that later, but Brunhild is the one who did that.
Right. And she funds that, and also, kind of funds a lot of things that happen in the church. And Pope Gregory was like huge. And the fact that he's, besties with a woman certainly changes some of his like catechism and canons and approach. I mean, there's a point where, Pope Gregory goes out on a limb and says, you know what, like, up till then, women, when they had their periods, weren't allowed in church. And he's like, it's not a sin to be menstruating. They should be allowed in church. And you wonder how much of this is him having like relationships with powerful women like Brunhild that are like, hey, let us in church. But that's kind of that seems really progressive.
Honestly, for today, it still is. But even with the Christianity thing, I'm just remembering now how you described her kind of Christianity she was raised with, which is kind of more like open to other people and like not super like fundamentalist. And that's the approach that they took when they went to England, which you described earlier. It's like, oh, instead of like burning down the church, let's just kind of change things a little. So like that, the fact that that was her approach is part of why it's successful. And then that changed the course of everything because England as a Christian power like blew up. But yeah, the fact that there's still roads and the name recognition. Yeah, I respect that. I respect that she gets higher than Fredegund and that. Honestly, I'm just like, why? I'd have to listen back. Like, I'm not sure how I gave Fredegund an 8, but I'm biased. So it just sounds like Brunhild did a lot more like specifically significant things. I might have just thought Fredegund was significant to me personally. And she is significant. I forget if we were recording when I told you, but someone told me someone named their car Fredegund. Someone sent me a picture of their avatar in like Pokemon or something is called Fredegund. I have to say in my Peloton account, my name is Fredegund. So yeah,
I love this.
You had to choose a name. And I'm like, has anyone, and it's like, has to be a name no one else has chosen. And I'm like, no one else has chosen Fredegund. First of all, a travesty. But second of all, I get it. Okay, let's do scheminess, because this is like a high score, obviously, because that covers, I explained it to you, but it's like scheminess for her, I think literal, but also just being cleverness, being able to pivot to see what's going on and react to it in a smart way, to have a plan, and then for those plans to actually happen and then to actually work, like just to be like one step ahead, kind of.
Yes, I'm 10 out of 10 here because I feel like she had a plan B and a plan C. Like even the whole idea of like, okay, husband dies, I'm in convent, secret marriage, rebellion, got my kids back, now I'm regent, now I do that. And, when she would be a diplomat or be negotiated, be like, okay, that didn't work. All right, I'm trying this way. She always had a great handle on the big picture, the big players, like where Francia fit in internationally. I think that's one thing that she kind of kept her head and her wits about her and was really able to take the long view.
And I think also she had the canniness to know kind of who to team up with, like who would be loyal to her. And even just stuff like, like standing in the middle of the battle, like just things that it was genuine, but it was also a way that she knew to get people to be loyal to her. She knew the value of that.
Crafting spectacle to her advantage. Yes. Like she was a great politician and diplomat. And a lot of those skills, I think, would still work today.
Definitely. And that's where part of like so much of it feels modern to me in a way. Like I could really easily transpose what she was doing into a more modern setting because it's a very timeless, way to just be smart about a really fraught political situation. Like you get strong allies, you make sure they know that you're loyal to them, be loyal to them back. And then, yeah. Especially for somebody who was in power for as long as she was so important to have those alliances. And then we have the sexism. So this is where it's like, how much did being a woman hold her back? How much more could she have enacted if she hadn't had to be busy dealing with, if she could have just been a ruler in her own name instead of having to wait for a son and then a grandson and to like And in a way, it didn't hold her back in some ways because she kind of still did become the ruler. But at the same time, if she hadn't had to dedicate brain space to having to be like, oh, Guntram, I'm just like this poor little widow. Won't you help me? Like if she could have just done stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think of how effective she was, she managed to be. And then you imagine if she wasn't, some of the resistance to her was purely that she was a woman. So if you take that resistance out of the equation and you have more people kind of on board with her ideas and her reforms, I think that's huge. That's consequential. I mean, that was part of what she always had to kind of go about it slant, but she clearly had the chops to be a ruler. I mean, she crafted herself, I think, like a lot of Roman emperors do. So yes, I think sexism was huge. It's amazing she was able to accomplish as much as she did, but I kind of mourn what more she could have done. I mean, you can be queen for, that long and hang on to power for 4 generations while everything's going to hell in a handbasket around you. That's amazing. And then you take the burden of not having sexism, you take that off her back and imagine if sort of unburdened how much more she could have accomplished. I'm 10 out of 10 here. Where are you leaning?
I'm leaning towards 10 out of 10 as well, because also there's the way that her life ended up, the way that she was sort of, her name continued on in legend, but I think this is how you describe it in the book, but it's just like her and Fredegund, like the men who came after them with a more fundamentalist sort of religious background, were like, women can't know this is possible, so let's hide this. If that hadn't happened, and if, like you said, if she had been able to rule on her own terms, not just as like sideways as the grandmother of the king, like I think she'd be on par with like Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan. Like I think that's the level she could have reached if it was a society that didn't hold her back to this level.
I could see that. And I also just, for her, despite sexism, for her constantly looking out for other women, that was also something for me where I was like, wow, like, that she still found time to do that. But also, as you're saying, if that could have really been allowed to blossom after her death, if people could have sort of continued that. And they tried, they certainly did. And there's certainly other kind of great examples of women who tried to follow in her footsteps and took her as an example. But if that had been more widely known, you imagine there has to be someone somewhere whose story was sort of snuffed out, and with a good example or a really clearly delineated map could have also made a huge difference.
Well, it's like you mentioned in your book, there's 1 or 2 other Frankish queens, and like one of them tried to do some stuff and then she was sent to a nunnery. Like, because the men were just like, we can't have a Fredegund Brunhild scenario again. Like, we need to nip this in the bud. But so many people are like, Queen Elizabeth I or whatever, like she's very well known for being a successful female monarch who also was like, I'm basically a man. Don't worry about it, because that's what she had to do. But like, if there were if what Brunhild was actually like, I didn't even read the second half of her ridiculous Wikipedia article that I feel like I need to go in and edit, but it's like, she proved her ruthlessness. And I'm just like, shut up, Wikipedia. But she's got this weird reputation where I think she should be, when there's, I'm in my kitchen, I'm looking at the fridge. I have these magnets of like great women from history. And it's like Cleopatra, Elizabeth I. And I'm like, if her story is better known, like Brunhild's story is just as impactful as those. It's just not known. And that's largely because it was stomped out. And also she was kind of cut off at the knees because she wasn't allowed to really flourish the way that Elizabeth was, for instance. And this brings us to, and this, I agree, this is challenging, the scandiliciousness, because Fredegund has that, right? Like Fredegund is like, come on.
She's 10 out of 10 there, isn't she? I mean,
She is 10. Fredegund got a 10 out of 10 in that category, because it's like going from like, even if all she did was be like someone who was enslaved, who then got the king to divorce his wife and murder his next wife to be with her, like that's. And so Brunhild, I think, and this is tricky, and it depends how you define scandalous, because there's people in the era who were like, oh my God, she's a woman who knows how to read and write. Terrible, probably. But she was accepted in her leadership role because she made these canny alliances. She was never, or was she ever accused of adultery or anything?
No, I mean there was always, yes, and later in life, in her 50s, they accused her of having an affair with a governor she installed, and she was at this point like in her mid 50s, and it was like, oh, that's why you installed that younger man, because secretly you're sleeping with him, you know, old bat kind of thing. So there were allegations and against her when she was sort of a you know, like at that point a grandmother, but
Oh, but you know what? You know what is scandalous that she did was doing the nunnery scheming and then marrying Marovich and then starting a coup.
there's a lot of it. I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head earlier when you were talking about how the things she pulls off are no less like kind of daring and audacious, but she goes about things in a much sort of quieter, more measured way. And by virtue of her background, she's a little less scandalous because, as you said, like no one's questioning. They might question the extent to which she wields power, but no one's like questioning whether she should have a seat, at least at the periphery of the table. You know, like, okay, we understand why she's here. So it wasn't necessarily scandalous because she was able to play it off as, well, I'm just doing this to watch out for my son. I'm just doing this to watch out for my grandsons. Which made it palatable in a way Fredegund was not. But then at the same time, you're like, she's taking on the church and she's, you know, kind of taking on these nobles and she's doing things that, you know, arming herself as a man and acting as a judge. So there's certainly a scandalous element, but certainly not to the degree where people were like, why is she even doing this? Particularly because she has a mom who does these sorts of things. So people could be like, where's she getting these ideas from? It was clear that they were like, oh, she's trying to be just like her mom, or she's trying to follow in this person's footsteps.
Well, and the reason why I have the 4 categories that I have is because it's rare for somebody to score highly in everything. Like there's some people who are really, really, really scandalous, but then they're not very significant or that sort of thing. So like she's significant, she's got the scheminess, but like the scandalousness is just that wasn't a thing that wasn't her personality, I don't think, to be like to try and shock people or intentionally or unintentionally. And when people are shocked by her, well, not shocked, but you said like the thing about like, oh, she must be having an affair with that guy. Like that's not her behavior causing that. It's not because she's like running around topless with him. It's like
That would have been awesome.
isn't that yeah, no, but like it was just people like, oh, that's more sexism, right? That's more just like, oh, a woman and a man are friends. That means they must be lovers. So I don't know. Like this is really I don't see Brunhild. There's definitely a level there of like the secret marriage. But the way that she sort of like glossed things over with her allies made it so nobody came against her in that way. Like to say like, oh, she's so scared, like the way they did to Fredegund, where they're like, you're having this affair. It's like, because Fredegund was just messy. That was just her way. Brunhild, yeah.
It was very polished.
Yeah. So I don't think she's scandalous, and I don't think she would want to be thought of as such.
No. And I think she scandalized people with some of the things she did, but she had built up such a power base. You know, I mean, there certainly would people be like, hold on, you're signing this treaty as if you're a king. You're expecting the title of a king. You are, you know, sitting as a judge. That was kind of like, but again, she had clergy. She had nobles who were like, no, it's okay. It's all right. Just look the other way. It's good.
And that's kind of right. And that's kind of the thing for this category I tend to think of. It's like in her time, did people look at her? Was she seen as a scandalous person or not? And I think for the most part, she was not, because she had the kind of like bureaucracy supporting her. So people weren't scandalized by what she did, even if the things were maybe scandalous. So I don't know where that lands.
Yes. At the very end, I think when she's like, okay, I'm going to take over again as regent. Don't worry, it's just for a couple of years that people were a little scandalized, because obviously then they rise up against her. So that was the one time when they're like, oh, hold on. No. You can't do this a 4th time.
Well, and that's the thing too. Yeah, it's like, sorry to interrupt, but like, had she been scandalous, they would have sent her to a nunnery much earlier. She couldn't really afford to be.
Right. So it was like she was able to kind of push it all the way to the limit. And they're like, hold on. No. You can't trick us again. Not number 4. So there is an element there, but it's not true, I don't think, like scandaliciousness.
Yeah. What do you think about like a 5?
That feels good to me. I was like 5 or 6.
Yeah. Because it's kind of like, it's there, but it's not. So that leaves her with a total score of 34. So in terms of this scale, Fredegund still higher than her, but 34 is certainly one of the highest scores. Like she's definitely top 10 with that.
All right.
I'm just wondering, Catherine de Medici has 35.5, so only a little bit more. And I said before, but Catherine de Medici had scandalous moments. She had like her flying squadron. She had like the poison rumors. Like, so I think that's why she's a bit higher.
Yeah, like a few massacres in there.
Exactly. Brunhild, like there was a lot of wars, there was a lot of battles, but she was never kind of like, let's just kill all the Protestants today. So that's lovely. Thank you so much. Are you allowed to talk about your next book?
I am a little bit. I'm in the I'm right now like deep in the archival documents for The Blood Countess, which will be kind of going over the cold case of Elizabeth Bathory. And for listeners who don't know who she is the 16th century Hungarian countess who is supposed to be the most prolific female serial killer in history. Although, you know, what I'm doing is essentially looking at brand new evidence and also reassessing some old evidence and looking at this through a feminist lens to talk about, was she framed, and if so, by who, and can we sort of conclusively settle once and for all the question of her guilt.
I was so excited when I just came across a mention that this book was coming out next year. I'm like, a book about Elizabeth Bathory from a feminist lens. And I'm like, Shelley's writing it. I was so excited because I do think I did an episode about Elizabeth Bathory years ago in like 2019. And at the time, I was like, this is going to be a cool episode about this like lady serial killer. And right away, I was like, this doesn't feel right. All the evidence about her, I'm just like, wait, this all feels real fake. This feels like, and the fact she's in the Guinness Book of World Records, I'm like,
it's so off. And let me tell you, it's been a deep dive. Like the evidence is scattered across the archives of 4 different countries, but as you piece it together, there's, it's fascinating what I always find, like you can still find out and what's still out there waiting to be discovered. But I think this is a case too of, real life being stranger than fiction. And I think as crazy as her story is right now, like the accepted story we know of her, like kind of torturing, virgins in this sort of like sadomasochistic,
bathing in
like
blood.
Yeah. The real story is just as wild a ride, if not more so.
I'm really happy to see that too, because after I did my Elizabeth Bathory episode, there's been a couple books that have come out in the last couple years that are like, The Blood Countess, she's a vampire. And I'm just like, oh, really? I did an episode. Didn't everyone hear it? Haven't we all changed our minds? No?
I can't believe that they didn't listen to it. We need to get that.
We need to get onto that. But you are going to be coming back when that book comes out because I'm excited to read it and to talk to you about it. So listeners, please know.
And thank you so much for that kind invitation and for the work that you do. I think it's just amazing what you do with this podcast and getting the word out about all of these. Like most of them are like really neglected figures. And I mean, it's just amazing the work you do. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope everybody knows, like, whether you can be Team Fredegund, you can be Team Brunhild, you can be Team both. People don't have to choose. But do you have a favorite?
I have been accused of being Team Brunhild, and I think I'm like, no, wait, it's just because there were slightly more sources from her life. And it is like having to choose between your children. A lot of days I feel more like a Fredegund, not that I have anywhere near the like nerve, like, she had ice in her veins, like, but I want to be a Fredegund. Do you know what I mean? Like when I'm grocery line, I want to be like, I could just assassinate that person that stole my parking spot. But unfortunately, no, I'm not a Fredegund as much as I would like to be, but I so admire kind of her chutzpah. But at the same time, I think, I'm always rooting for Brunhild, particularly when I was like, yes, like you're standing up for other women, like, yay, you. So it depends what day you catch me on. There are definitely some days when I'm like Team Brunhild all the way. And then there are other times where I'm like Fredegund.
I think it's like the angel and the devil on your shoulder, but it's like Brunhild and Fredegund, where it's just like, I want my parking spot. And then it's like, let's just like talk kindly to somebody and then like gently get what we want by working together. It's like situational who one wants to embody. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you still firmly Team Fredegund?
I can't not be. I went into your book and I'm like, I'm going to read this book from a Brunhild point of view. And I was reading it because it starts off with Brunhild, and then your chapter, you're just like, and then a servant was there, and I'm like, oh my god, who's a servant? And then it's like, and then he loved her. I'm like, and at the end, you're like, and her name was Fredegund. I'm like, yes, it was Fredegund. And I was just like, no, and you're reading this from Brunhild. I'm just like, oh, I love her so much. So like, in reading the book and talking to you, I'm definitely, I don't want to have to be one over the other, but I will say Fredegund is maybe my favorite person I've ever profiled on the podcast. She just hits every sweet spot for me. So it's unfair to put anyone against her, but I will say Brunhild, I have a new appreciation for. At first I read and I'm just like, she's the one who's working against Fredegund. She's my enemy. But it's like, no. She's also a cool and interesting person. The men are the enemy. Both of them are the heroes. So.
Well, I appreciate you having an open mind.
Thank you so much. This is something that listeners have requested for a while. So I'm glad to, give Brunhild her due. And I'm glad that she takes her place in the pantheon of vulgar history.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So Shelley's book is called The Dark Queens, The Bloody Rivalry That Forged the Medieval World. It's an incredibly good book. It's really like the story that we just talked about. You heard how she described it. Like she describes it all so well. So it's fascinating history, just like bananas plot twists, but it's like actual stuff that actually happened. And she writes it in a really accessible way where I think you'll enjoy it if you're like a professor of history, if you're a person who just likes to read random books. Like it's such a good book. Paperback is available. And as we get more information about her Elizabeth Bathory book, The Blood Countess, rest assured I will let you know. But you can keep up with Shelley and what she's up to at shelleypuhak.com. If you don't know how to spell that, it's in the show notes as well. And I also just want to let you know that you can keep up with me at instagram.com/vulgarhistory. I don't know why I described it like that. It's just at vulgarhistorypod on Instagram, not Vulgar History on Instagram. That's an erotic account run by other people who are not affiliated with me, but I wish them all the best. I'm also on various other social medias at Vulgar History, like wherever you are, I'm probably there, and you can message me if you have ideas. You know what? Let me know if you're Team Fred or Team Brun, as I'm thinking of her now, or Team both. I'm curious. I'm going to put a poll on Instagram when this episode comes up. You can also, because, festive holiday season, gift giving is upon us, you can get merchandise for this podcast at vulgarhistory.com/store. As I'm speaking, I'm fairly confident there's a sale, a discounted sale going on. And if there's not one going on today, probably today or the next day, because this time of year, there's constantly sales. That's hosted on TeePublic. If you're outside the US, you can get better shipping if you go to vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Hopefully by the time you're hearing this, I've got some festive holiday merch available, which is designed by Karen Moynihan from the Double Love podcast and says tits season. So if you want to get Vulgar History stuff to get you through the holidays, that's there. You can also support the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, where for $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes. For $5 or more a month, you get the early ad-free access, as well as bonus episodes, things like Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk about costume dramas with Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. We're about to do one about The Lion in Winter, which is going to be an interesting discussion, and you can hear why when we get to that. But also I do, the after show is there, where sometimes I have extended conversations with podcast guests. So this asshole, where I talk about men from history. And also if you join the Patreon, we're at like 480 members right now, and I have vowed that when we get to 500 members, I will do a John Knox episode of So This Asshole. You can join the Patreon for free as well if you just want to like get the numbers up to make me do that. Anyway, you can also get transcripts of recent episodes available at vulgarhistory.com. Thank you to Aveline Malik from The Wordery for providing these transcripts to our recent episodes. And I do want to let you know, with the festive gift-giving season upon us, etc., I do have a gift guide that I've been updating constantly on Instagram at Vulgar History. So there's a highlight there that's the Vulgar History gift guide, where I'm highlighting small businesses that sell things that I think would be good gifts to give someone in your life that is maybe you, that are Vulgar History reminiscent. For instance, there's a cross-stitch pattern of Fredegund that I have the link on there to buy that. Mary Queen of Scots, ghost dolls, various things. And then also, if you want to get somebody the gift of me, a video of me, I've joined Cameo just for this holiday season. So if you want to get a little video from me, Hepburn may or may not appear. Her contract stipulates that she will not be tied down. Anyway, I'm on Cameo as well. And then also we have our brand partner, here's Hepburn. She might show up just like that if you get a video from me on Cameo. She might not. Anyway, our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry, is another great option for gift giving as well. This is a 100% woman-owned business using 100% recycled gold, and they make beautiful pieces that are inspired by women from history and women from mythology, including people like Boudica, Cleopatra, Agrippina, and Anne Boleyn. And as you're listening to this, I do believe that they make pieces in like solid gold, and they also have a more affordable gold vermeil. And I believe the Anne Boleyn gold vermeil should now be available. And if you're going to be buying some pieces from there, please remember you can always get 15% off all items from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code VULGAR at checkout. And I've got a really exciting episode next week. It's our festive holiday spectacular. There is some interesting connections in that episode to this week's episode. Fredegund and Brunhild do come up, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Murachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.